Is it always a good idea? And there are two areas that I thought we would consider. What the number two here is that second rationale paper of do we connect letters with sounds and spoken words. Okay, so we'll save that for number two here. But the first one is talking in the story reading context. Let me see, I think I have a slide of this. The strategies in the comprehension analysis of age-appropriate text. These are sort of the main ones. And you can see the first one, read stories daily, obviously. Plan support for story reading. In other words, are there places you need to, which keywords might you support? What places might need a little comprehension support? Read a story several times. Help children understand the words and sentences in a story. That's what I want to talk about. Discuss the story after reading it, and model deeper levels of reasoning. I think there's a debate and an attention in the field. It's all around later reading comprehension and comprehension strategies and how storybooks especially are being used in the early years to support vocabulary acquisition. And I guess maybe I'll stop with that because the big emphasis on vocabulary acquisition from storybooks. So many of the approaches for supporting vocabulary development from storybook reading has, and also to discuss a few things, it's a lot of interrupting of the story reading and also asking children who knows what such and such means. You come to a new word, it's a key word, you say, who knows what the word means? And maybe some discussion, and then finally you sort of say, well, actually what it means. But I think the big thing here is the interruption during the story reading to attend to vocabulary acquisition. And inasmuch as there are other questions, they tend to be quite literal. Now, if you talk to reading comprehension people, they will say, I'm talking Isabel Beck, Bill Teal, and others. They would recommend don't ask literal specific questions as you go through. Every 3 or 4 pages, if there's something else you could ask that's a bigger question, that's more inferential, fine. Okay. Or it'd be okay with most of them, I think, to wait until the end of the story in the discussion, ask some of those questions. There is some evidence that how we approach text with young children teaches them what they're supposed to do in relation to text. How minute the details are they should pay attention to. So whether it's a literal detail of, okay, so what colors, corduroys, overalls? That would be an example, okay. Right. So if that's the focus of the questions, and I know I'm going to get those on every page, you were teaching me to think in certain ways about when I interact with text. And so we have to always keep in mind that children are learning more than what we maybe are focusing on. I mean, we maybe are focusing on vocabulary. They're focusing on that, but they're learning something bigger than that. So the reading comprehension, some of my friends there would say, you are destroying big-time comprehension for the later years, because you're telling children not to focus on the big ideas. You're pulling them to literal details, and you're chopping this up all the way through the book. Now, there are no longitudinal studies, none, that really answers this in the way we need to have it answered. There are some studies of first grade reading and the balance between decoding and comprehension and what the level of discussion is and some some outcomes later on. But we don't have anything from the preschool years that follows through these different intervention approaches to see, what the outcomes are. And the Price and, where was that article? I had it. Okay. The Price, Cleek, and Huberty article that's in the Recurrent Reading Research Quarterly, or a very recent one, and they were the ones that studied parents and the talk around the books and found that there was very little talk compared to expository text, very little talk around narrative. Parents tended to read the story all the way through. Now, unfortunately in this study, they have no child outcomes. This just kills me. If you're going to go all the trouble of observing this many parents over this amount of time, could you just test the children so we know what the outcomes are? This is our problem. And I just know, I mean, research is so hard to do. It costs so much money that, we end up getting a piece of something and then we don't know, okay, so what does it matter for children? But they do say something very interesting here. To date, there is no evidence regarding how much interaction is optimal or whether too frequent interactions may interfere with the benefits of book sharing, e.g., making it hard for the child to follow the story because it is interrupted so often. Future research might fruitfully explore the issue of optimal amounts of book sharing discussion, which may not turn out to be a simple relationship, but may instead vary for different child language outcomes, e.g., vocabulary. In other words, some of the current approaches that focus on vocabulary support in that, every page sort of, you might very well, and in fact you do, get boosts in vocabulary. So you might get vocabulary, but maybe you want, there are the list here, vocabulary, sentence complexity, story narrative skills, and later reading comprehension skills. So it could be that different approaches in our early intervention story reading could have very different outcomes. And we might very well be getting vocabulary much better from some of the interventions. And while vocabulary alone will help reading comprehension, keep in mind that identification level, whether it's expressive or receptive, doesn't account for all that much. It's grammar, syntax and grammar, listening comprehension, and definitional level vocabulary that really is the big predictor of reading comprehension. So it's just an area that we need to really think about, I think. And I'm not one at this point to want to back off of using word support strategies in the story reading context. I have backed off in terms of how I want to do that, and a little less interruptive and more teacher comment as opposed to throwing it out to the children so there's not too much interruption. I also think the multiple reads, you've got another shot or two at supporting those words. We don't have to do everything with reading one. And how would you like to go to a movie and have the lights come on? So what was that? We wouldn't like that. And I've been in classrooms where literally things kind of break away and there's discussion about a word or who's answering, and literally there'll be a couple of children that say, read! Okay? So we have to be, but I think it's a really important thing to think about because there's such strong evidence of word support outcomes in terms of boosts in vocabulary. Now, if you go to the NELP report, and I forget which page it is, underline. What's going on in the ceiling back there? What? Oh, okay, the fans. Okay, that's all right. Okay. All right, the NELP report. If you look at the chapter on the shared reading interventions, some were done at home, some were done in schools. Very interesting outcomes there. The outcomes were for simple vocabulary, not much for complex language, meaning syntax, grammar, or listening comprehension. Now let's go through that again. If the biggest predictors of reading comprehension in the end are listening comprehension, definitional vocabulary, grammar, and syntax, and we're getting mostly simple vocabulary, definitional level, from shared story reading interventions, and we are not getting listening comprehension, grammar, and syntax. Now they have a sentence that says, we don't know why these outcomes are as they are. Is it something about the nature of story reading that children cannot somehow benefit from the language there to increase their syntax, for example. Because that language in narratives is more abstract, it's a different structure. And maybe it's too remote. Maybe you do have to be in conversations. Teresa and I were talking about this. Maybe that's where the expansion of syntax comes from. So that's kind of one hypothesis, that maybe it's the nature of the beast. But they said the other possibility is it's the nature of the shared reading interventions. And I think somewhere maybe in the middle there. And in terms of accessing the storybooks language, I remember a number of years ago I was observing, not ELL, but an area of the country where the poverty is like I saw in 1965 and really don't see in urban areas anymore. I mean, almost the swelled bellies from nutrition. I mean, very rural. The rural poor is really, really something. But anyway, the teacher was reading fairly good narratives, but she had to tell that story almost as much as she read it. And she read Corduroy, which is this was maybe early, or maybe mid-October, so we're not very far into the year. But she knew the book so well she hardly even had to look at the book. And so she read a sentence and she would turn to the children and say, so it was early in the morning and Corduroy, I can't remember the story now, I should know that by heart. But anyway, every single sentence she read practically, she turned and explained and reviewed and recast that in more accessible language. And the children were just so attentive. And I've never forgotten that situation. And the children, I said, you're telling the story, you're reading, but you're also kind of explaining. She said, yes, because when I wasn't doing that, I was losing them. They were not engaging with the story. She said, and she back off. And she liked some of these books because they were her favorites, which is, a good enough reason, I guess. They were good narratives. So she was having to translate in a way. Okay, now, it's probably the case that if she had just kept reading those higher level narratives as they were on the pages, and just you have to sit here and listen, I'm not sure it would have benefited those children's syntax. I don't think they could have engaged with it. But the way she was doing that book and her own language was very complex, but it was more in child conversational language. So I think there might be something to the question of whether listening to storybooks, even though the language is very complex in storybooks, that's all well and good, but can the children access it? So I think that's something worth looking at. And I think there's some ways of reading that I'd like to see varied in research. One of them is model of how that teacher read and told. And then I think there probably is an issue with the typical shared reading interventions that focus so heavily on vocabulary. And along those lines, in one of those programs, I know there's a book that I like, Hooray a Piñata, and I was looking at the guidance for that book in a program, intervention program. And I think it was for the second reading, they suggested that you start with the first page. How many of you know the book Hooray a Piñata? Okay, so it's you're in a minority. Okay, let me fill you in on children's literature here. Oh, okay, all right. So anyway, it's about a little girl named Clara whose birthday is coming up, and she has a friend, Samson. And the book opens with the two of them in a sandbox. And she says to him, I'm going to have a birthday party. And he said, oh, you are? And she said, yes. And my mother and I are going to go to a shop this afternoon and buy the piñata for my party. Would you like to come? And he says, yes, I love piñatas. Now, in that sandbox, there's like everything under the sun in that sandbox that they're sort of playing with. Now, for the reading to the suggestion for the teacher in this program is have the children look at that picture and identify and talk about all the things in the sandbox. Now, that is off track, okay? My reading comprehension friends would scream and have when I show them that. And so they would say, wait a minute, in terms of the story, what would one want to say? Or what would one want to ask? Something like, oh, looks to me like Claire and Samson are pretty good friends. She asked him, seems to me they're kind of good friends. What do you think? And of course, the preschoolers probably say yes. And you say, well, what made you think so? And whatever they say, and what made me think so? So see, that's narrative, that's inferencing. that's what my reading comprehension people would like for us to focus on. And I think, that's an extreme case of pulling kids off track, of what are all the things you see in the picture. You see the setting. Could have been anywhere. They could have been in the backyard in swings. So it's not important for the narrative what this particular setting was. It's just some setting where they were and talked about the birthday party and she invited him. So that's what I mean. And some of you, not many years old as I am, but you remember those picture posters, those big ones we used to use. You remember what I'm talking about? There was a whole set on community helpers, and there was a whole, I'm wondering, why don't we just pull the pictures back? We don't have a narrative issue there, and they're great pictures. And then maybe treat storybooks a little differently, knowing we don't have to get so much vocabulary from them, and we can sort of have our mind a little more on the comprehension issues. But anyway, I think these are big issues, and I was just startled in the NELF report what they're reporting, because one of the home-based studies that Senechal is a Canadian woman who actually did a beautiful study on home-based literacy and book reading, and her question was, this is kind of back in the days when if you just read to children, they'll learn everything. And they'd already had a few studies, Crane and Thorsten, in, 1985, they said, no, they don't really learn too many alphabetic skills from story reading, frankly. So Seneca looked at just naturally occurring parents and observed and took information and wanted to know who was doing specific print-related teaching, who had the workbooks, who had flashcards, who had anything having to do with print, who helped the kids spell words when they wanted to, and who just read stories. And actually, I think more of the parents just read stories as opposed to doing some literacy skills. But it was very clear that the children who had just been read stories at home and hadn't had some literacy skills experiences were not good on literacy skills. The children who had the literacy skills, home activities, were great on literacy skills. So, we know that we can't get some things out of storybooks like literacy skills, although some people have tried to do that. And I think that's another issue for the reading comprehension people. For example, I'm introducing a book, I read the title and say, okay, let's count the number of words in the title. As opposed to, I'm trying to think of a title. I wonder what that means, or I see on the book. In other words, some meaning. We count the words, we find letters in the words. Nothing is said about what the title means. Okay, so, and that's just extreme, but I've seen that. So I've seen print storybooks, and some of this was done by Laura Justice, who I really like, and I think she's changed her tune a bit. But she did a very good intervention study along the Seneca lines, saying if you don't teach literacy skills explicitly, if you just read books, you're not going to learn the literacy skills. And then she went sort of through a phase of, well, let's teach more print skills with storybooks. Well, you can, and if you emphasize the print skills, they will get better on that. But the big question is, what are we doing to reading comprehension? So, we have other contexts, I think, and I say pull those old pictures back. Those were great pictures. I don't even know if we can find pictures like that anymore in catalogs. I was looking the other day and I couldn't find them anymore. Those big poster pictures, they were wonderful in the old days. And we used those to talk with children all the time before we read books to them. Remember, we didn't read books. Very much in preschool. At least my background was we really didn't read to children much, but we used those pictures. Anyway, yes, you have a comment.
I just wanted to mention there's a social emotional kit called Second Step, and I may be saying something wrong in there, but it has, the whole thing is focused on big pictures and it has all kinds of script on the back. But it's not a start here and read to the class.
Okay, it's to discuss.
So you can hold the picture and be seeing all these prompts for yourself, and they're all about situations of something happening to children. It's pretty good.
Yes.
Pretty good stuff. So it's the big picture.
It is. And actually, I was talking about the classroom where the two teachers were anchoring the groups, and one was in the blocks and one was in a small group, and was using pictures of a construction site. I wish I had a tape of that teacher's interactions, discussion with those children. She just had 4 in that small group. But she started saying, okay, well, what do you see? And I remember one little boy, he pointed to what was the chimney. He just pointed, and she said, so what do you see? Or what are those? Or what is that? Or something. He said, a brick. And she said, you're right, those are bricks. Structure on the top of that building what do we call that? And he didn't know, and so she just, chimney. And then she was saying, and the very top part of a house or a building we call, what's the name of that? And the child knew it was the roof. So she was asking, she was eliciting language, but she was doing so much teaching, and the picture was so rich. But she was using a picture. So I'd like to see a little more of that. Anyway, yes?
What's your take on the usage of audiobooks?
Oh, audiobooks, okay. I love them in terms of predictable text. And I think for ELL, English language development, I think having a listening post and giving them access to listen, for phonology, and also for some formulaic language from songs and books, predictable books. I do not like them for narratives. I would much rather the children go to the library corner and, or even, I don't mind small groups that have as their focus books, even if the teacher can't be there. If you put the books that they've been read, they've heard 3 or 4 times, and there's some really nice sharing around. So I want narratives retold. But I think predictable text, but having said that, back to the information text and related problems of content knowledge, there are wonderful CDs out there from National Geographic and other places. And I keep thinking, particularly for child care programs that are open from 7 in the morning till 6, and that afternoon period, some children have gone home, but you've got the period of 3:34 to 6 o'clock for some children. And they're just kind of hanging out because the teachers need that time to clean up the classroom and kind of get ready for the next day. And I just keep thinking, gee, what would some really good information CDs about fish or animals in the forest, anything, and those materials exist. So I think there's, and I also think that software, that computer software that's good, that can help children with alphabet letter recognition and some of those things, if used well. Rarely do I see computers used very well at the preschool level. They're just over there doing whatever. But I don't like narratives on tape. For that reason, I like children to retell. Okay, where are we in all this? The final reflection on bringing print and sound together.